The Horus Heresy ends exactly as history remembers it. Horus is defeated. The traitor legions are broken. Terror survives at an unimaginable cost. The Emperor is entombed upon the Golden Throne, and the Imperium enters an age of decay. But something fundamental does not happen. The warp does not crown permanent rulers over reality. No eternal masters rise from the storm. No single power locks the galaxy into an endless cycle of corruption. Instead, the warp remains fractured, unstable, and dangerously unfinished. Chaos exists, but it never reaches full strength. This changes everything that comes after the heresy. The Imperium does not collapse into total paralysis. The enemies of humanity do not gain infinite endurance. History does not freeze into a permanent nightmare. Warhammer 40K remains violent, cruel, and unforgiving, but it is no longer trapped inside a future that cannot change. This is not a story about victory or salvation. This is the story of a galaxy that narrowly avoids its worst possible fate and is forced to live with the consequences. To understand how this reshapes the universe, we must look at what the warp becomes when absolute dominance fails to emerge. In this timeline, the warp still responds to emotion, conflict, and thought. Rage fuels it. Fear distorts it. Ambition twists it into unstable forms. However, the Chaos powers never consolidate into permanent, self-sustaining entities capable of ruling entire dimensions. They remain fragmented concentrations of influence, constantly clashing, constantly eroding each other. The Horus Heresy feeds them an enormous surge of violence and betrayal, but instead of stabilizing them, the war burns them out. By the time the conflict ends, the warp is exhausted rather than empowered. Demonic manifestations become rare and unstable, requiring extreme conditions to sustain. Possession is temporary and dangerous even for the entities attempting it. Warp storms still threaten fleets, but they fail to expand into permanent regions of control. The warp remains a weapon and a hazard, not a sovereign domain. Chaos becomes a threat that can be contained, weakened, and disrupted instead of an inevitable force that always returns stronger. For the first time since humanity discovered warp travel, the balance shifts away from endless escalation. The Imperium emerges from the Horus Heresy shattered but not spiritually crippled. The Emperor is bound to the Golden Throne, yet the pressure upon it is fundamentally different. Without overwhelming warp dominance, the throne functions as a stabilizing engine rather than a failing life support prison. The Astronomicon burns with greater consistency, allowing warp travel to remain lethal but navigable. Entire sectors avoid isolation. Communication breakdowns become regional instead of universal. The High Lords of Terror still consolidate power, bureaucracy still spreads, and authoritarian rule still defines human civilization, but paranoia does not consume everything. The Imperium no longer defines its entire existence around the fear of chaos infiltration. Military doctrine shifts toward containment and long-term defense rather than constant purges. Humanity becomes rigid, disciplined, and brutal, yet it avoids total institutional panic. Survival is no longer dependent on blind fanaticism but on adaptation and control. The fate of the Primarchs changes dramatically in this altered future. Those who turned during the heresy are not elevated into immortal warp champions. They remain terrifying warlords, masters of destruction, and living symbols of betrayal, but they are finite beings. They can be wounded. They can retreat. They can be destroyed. Loyalist Primarchs face fewer warp-based disappearances and long-term imprisonments. Some return earlier, while others never vanish at all. Guilliman's reforms gain momentum sooner, slowing the Imperium's fragmentation. Without eternal chaos avatars manipulating events beyond time, the great figures of the age remain bound by consequence. History regains forward motion. Victories matter. Defeats matter. Legends are allowed to end instead of looping forever. Other factions feel the consequences immediately. The Eldar suffer catastrophic collapse, but their long-term extinction slows. Fragmented recovery becomes possible. Orks remain endlessly violent, but they lose an invisible amplifier that once fed their wars into something far greater. Their conflicts remain brutal yet contained. Tyranid advance signals weaken without a massive psychic beacon drawing them inward. Their arrival is delayed, fragmented, and less coordinated. The Necrons awaken into a galaxy that is damaged but survivable. Their strategies shift toward control and long-term dominance instead of desperate annihilation. The Tau rise into a universe that still has room to expand rather than one already consumed by infinite corruption. The warp itself evolves into a different kind of battlefield. It remains hostile, unpredictable, and lethal, but it no longer functions as a realm enforcing permanent control. Instead of fixed dominions, it behaves like a constantly shifting storm. Warp routes change. Threats emerge and fade. No single force imposes eternal law. Human psykers are still feared, but systematic training expands instead of collapsing into mass executions. Controlled usage becomes viable. Warp-based technology improves cautiously rather than being abandoned entirely. Strategic planning replaces blind superstition. Reality begins resisting chaos influence instead of amplifying it endlessly. The galaxy becomes unstable, but not enslaved. Warhammer 40K transforms from a locked apocalypse into a living timeline. Empires rise, fracture, and reform. Borders shift. Alliances change. History moves forward. This future is not kind. It is not peaceful. But it is no longer trapped. Without chaos at full strength, the galaxy becomes uncertain again, and uncertainty reshapes everything. In a universe defined by endless war, possibility becomes the most dangerous force of all. The galaxy remains dark. Worlds burn. Billions die. War never ends. The difference is structural rather than emotional. The universe is no longer designed to remain broken forever. There is no cosmic mechanism enforcing endless decay. Progress becomes possible, even if it is slow and fragile. Knowledge is restricted but not erased entirely. Technology stagnates but does not collapse into myth. Humanity survives not because it is destined to rule, but because it learns to endure without feeding the warp endlessly. Chaos remains dangerous, but it is no longer self-renewing on a cosmic scale.